So again, just let me reiterate a very, very warm welcome to the Centre for Catholic Formation. My name is Mark Nash. I'm the director here. Various different colleagues doing all kinds of work with regards to adult formation, catechetics, and working with evangelisation. And each year we do a sort of a series of talks, normally post-Easter. We've done all kinds of things. Last year we celebrated our Golden Jubilee here, so this centre is almost 51 years old. And last year we had a series of talks for our Golden Jubilee on various different themes, and we decided that was such a wonderful pattern that we decided to repeat it again this summer. And we couldn't think of a better theme, a better topic for this series of talks than Cardinal John Henry Newman. So I don't really want to take too much of your talk, Mgr Roderick, but in 1991, Newman was proclaimed venerable by the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, which is the first stage in the canonisation process. He was beatified on the 19th of September 2010 at an open-air mass up in Crofton Park. Some of you may well have been there, which was celebrated by Pope Benedict XVI up in Birmingham, in what was the first papal state visit to the UK. In November 2018, the Vatican approved a second miracle involving the unexplained healing of a pregnant American woman from a life-threatening diagnosis, and this was investigated by the Archdiocese of Chicago. And so, on the 13th of February 2019, this year, it was announced that Pope Francis had approved the decree concerning this miracle, which opened the way to Newman's canonisation, which is expected to take place in Rome later this year. So, in honour of Newman, we will be exploring the legacy of England's most famous convert and his ongoing importance in living, in teaching, and in passing on the faith. Tonight is the first in a series of 4 talks, and it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce tonight's speaker. Mgr Roderick Strange is an author of several books, including a good few on Newman, including Newman 101, John Henry Newman, A Mind Alive, which we have some copies for sale tonight, Newman, A Portrait in Letters, and others including The Catholic Faith and Living Catholicism. He is formerly the rector of the Pontifical Beda College in Rome, serving in that position for many years, guiding men from all over the world into the priesthood. He's been a university chaplain at Oxford, a parish priest in Cheshire, and chairman of the National Conference of Priests. He currently holds a professorship in theology at St Mary's University, Twickenham. So here to talk about Newman and teaching the faith, Mgr Roderick Strange.
Mark, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk about Newman. I think you gave me an earlier title, Educating the Laity. Yeah. But it'll all weave together. At least that's the theory. Just to say something, just to move us into this topic. We're being joined. There's nothing like starting for people to come. It's great. I was at a Jesuit school. I was a pupil there. And so one of the questions I'm often asked is, why didn't you become a Jesuit? And my stock answer is because I didn't want to be a teacher. Where I was at Stonyhurst. There were more than 20 in those days, more than 20 Jesuits on the staff. And a good third of them, I would say, were old boys of the school. Now, I was very happy at school, but I didn't want to spend my entire life there. Of course, things have shifted, so it wouldn't probably have been like that. Well, it certainly wouldn't have been like that had it happened. But Michael said, no, I don't want to be a teacher. I would prefer to be a pastoral priest. So what's actually happened? Well, after ordination, when I came back, having been ordained in Rome in 1969, came back from Rome in 1970, and I went to do a doctoral thesis on Newman at Oxford. I was then, after 4 years there, I was appointed as a chaplain to a new large Catholic comprehensive school. After 3 years there, I went back to Oxford for 12 years as chaplain and also was made a member of the theology faculty, so I did some teaching there. Once back in the diocese, of course, I was a school governor, and very shortly after that was made director of our religious education service, and then after that I was sent to Rome as rector of the Beda, where of course I was doing some teaching, and now here I am with the grand title of being a professor at St Mary's University, Twickenham, which I'm very happy with. But I mean, I haven't really got away from teaching very much in the course of these 50 years. And just sort of thinking about Newman, because there is so much that can be said about him, and he produced so much, 40 books, 32 volumes of letters, all sorts of other things. How many of you, as a matter of interest, are teachers? As such, no, just a few of you are teachers, right. And how many of you know lots about Newman? I don't want to be telling you all sorts of things that you're very well aware of. But just to say this, Newman, 1801 to 1890, virtually the whole of the 19th century. When you're hearing about an event and wondering how old he was at the time, he was a year younger than the date on which it's taking place. It's quite simple and straightforward from that point of view. One of the things I find helpful when considering that mass of material that he produced, as I say, 40 books, 32 volumes of letters, is to think of 4 key points. One is, they're like sort of pegs, if you like, for thinking about the way he was considering things. The first peg is revelation. Newman was insistent on our religion as a revealed religion. What we believe, in other words, is not of our own making. It has been revealed to us. Father Stephen Desain, the great Newman scholar, used to say that that was the theme that gave Newman's life its unity. But what has been revealed, of course, needs to be received. Revelation is received by faith, not only the faith of individuals, but the faith of the community. So a second key feature in Newman's thinking is the church. Where is the church? How is the church to be found, the body of Christ to be discovered most fully? And then that revelation that has been received in the church needs also to be articulated. And so a third key point for Newman was dogma. He used to say that, if we were all perfect, then there could simply be the scriptures and we would all understand the scriptures and it would be perfectly straightforward. But we're not perfect, and we need to reflect upon these things and to have them articulated. And so the importance of dogma, and what has been revealed, received and articulated, then of course needs to be communicated. And so the importance for him of education. From first to last, he used to say, or he said education has been my line. It was in 1863, a quotation that you've got there on that sheet. It was actually something he wrote in a journal. It was probably the darkest time of his life, the most difficult time of his life. But he says there, Catholics in England, from their very blindness, cannot see that they are blind. To aim at improving the condition, the status of the Catholic body by a candid survey of their argumentative basis, of their position relatively to the philosophy and the character of the day, by giving them juster views, by enlarging and refining their minds, in one word, by education, is, in their view, more than a superfluity or a hobby, it is an insult. It implies that they are deficient in material points. Now, from first to last, education, in this large sense of the word, has been my line. So look what he's doing there, what he's called the importance of education. That's my line. Not just narrow classroom teaching, but hoping to give people better arguments, a careful survey of the argumentative basis, in tune with the culture of the day, their position relatively to the philosophy and the character of the day, so that you're creating, so that creates a sounder position, giving them juster views, and then broadening and deepening their understanding by enlarging and refining their minds. So that's what he had a feel for that. That was what was so important for him. In his early days, he had been a tutor at Oriel in Oxford, at a time when Oriel was the most distinguished of the colleges. It was in its great heyday, with the early days of the 19th century. And Newman, as a very young man, was elected a fellow there, and sort of, as it were, developed his enthusiasm for intellectual excellence at that time, but also came to recognize other things, that it wasn't enough to have intellectual excellence. For him, it was also important to educate the whole person. And so he was, what he wanted to do was to educate undergraduates sort of as completely as he could. But the style at the time was simply, I mean, these were lads of 16, 17 years of age, 18 years of age. They weren't as old as people would normally be going to university today. But the style at the time was lecturers, tutors just taught whoever was there, whatever their caliber. Whereas Newman said, no, the brighter people need special tuition. And he fell out with the college authorities over that, so that eventually he was no longer given pupils, and that led to a greater freedom for him to do other things. But the point that I'm making is that his concern from the earliest times as an educator was not simply teaching, giving out, but actually for the person. And I think that's really what is crucial for us when we're thinking about how do we educate? What are we trying to do? And then what he went on to do, of course, amongst other things, was to be the famous preacher that he was at the university church. He was vicar of the university church. He offered lectures for parishioners and for others who wished to come. And then as a Catholic, he was invited to found a university in Dublin. The Irish bishops were keen on establishing a new university and invited Newman to become the first rector, which was, again, a complicated story and not a particularly happy period of his life. But it did lead to him writing one of his great books, The Idea of a University, which we'll look at briefly at least, or in passing, as we continue. When he came back from Dublin, he was in Dublin essentially from 1851 to 1858, 7 years. When he came back, he then decided to found a school. He was the superior of the oratory that he had founded, instructed by Rome to do so, but founded and based in Birmingham. And he wanted to establish a school. In those days, it could, just speaking generally, the great, as it were, famous public schools, Eton, Harrow, Winchester, and so forth, gave people wonderful education, but were not really so keen on, if you like, the pastoral side of education. That was changing, I suppose, in Arnold's Rugby. But otherwise, the great, as it were, the great public schools were academically excellent, but pastorally rather weak. The Catholic schools, like Stonyhurst, like Oscott, which was a school at the time, and so forth, they were very good pastorally, but rather weak academically. Newman wanted to found a school which would bring those two things together, particularly because, of course, many of his friends, or a fair number of his friends, had, like him, become converts. It wasn't possible in those days for Catholics to go to Oxford. And so he wanted to found a school where the sons of these friends of his could receive the kind of education that they would hope for them. So that enthusiasm for education really from the start. But when people talk about Newman and education, it is so often it's what he was, they're often thinking, most usually thinking about his work that I've mentioned, the idea of a university. These were essentially, initially, lectures that he was invited to give by Archbishop Paul Cullen, later Cardinal, who had invited him to become the rector there. And he wrote and delivered 5 of these lectures. There are 9 altogether. The last 4 he wrote up. He did it all in about 18 months, an extraordinary feat, but I think it indicates his mastery of the subject that he was dealing with, that he could produce so formidable and significant a work in so short a space of time. What's its standing now? What sort of status does it have now? Well, you won't be surprised if I say to you that people at times are much more critical of it these days. They say the kind of university that Newman is envisaging is simply not the kind of university that we have any longer these days. Because these days people want, when they come to university, well, first of all, our universities are governed, as we know, by market forces. So how do they get the money in? How many students can you have? The more students you have, the more money you get. If you've got students that could have been coming to me, then you're taking them away from me. There is that tension in university education, in tertiary education, which is a sadness, I think. Well, obviously it is, because I think to some degree institutions which they might have had a rivalry on the sporting field, but who are essentially allies, inevitably they're cast to some degree these days as competitors. I mean, Newman wouldn't have had a thought about all that. Wouldn't have had a thought about the kind of budgeting issues that people have these days. Again, people coming to university these days, and remember that education has always been developing. In Newman's day, as an undergraduate, people took scarcely no exams. They just went to university by and large for several years, and then they went off and governed the empire or whatever. The idea that they were taking exams and being tested the way that people are today was not part of university life in those days. And moreover, the idea was that you offered people an entry into, as it were, universal knowledge. Whereas nowadays, of course, people come because they want to be trained for a career. And if they're being trained for a career, then they need to become specialists, so they specialize. And one of the consequences, of course, of specialization is fragmentation. You may be expert in this particular area, but you don't necessarily know what's happening in the next room or in the next department. Sometimes you don't even know what's happening in your own department, what another colleague may be teaching. So, I mean, those are 3 ways in which universities today are very different from the universities as Newman envisaged them. Market forces, training. He said it's not about utility coming to university, but it is for people now. Am I being taught something useful? Am I getting my money's worth? Am I becoming sufficiently expert to get a good job? Those are the issues that affect people now. Newman was not thinking at all in those terms. All the same, people who would alert us to the difference between then and now also recognize the value, something of the value of what Newman had to say. Professor Stefan Collini from Cambridge, while saying that Newman's book describes an institution, so people are deluding themselves if they think that Newman's book describes an institution that at all closely resembles universities today. But then he goes on that our 21st century universities need a literary voice like Newman's, of comparable power, to articulate in the idiom of our time the ideal of the untrammeled quest for understanding. And I could give you other examples. John Roberts, the historian, was Vice-Chancellor of Southampton University, then Warden of Merton College, speaks of Newman's idea as being utterly remote from the academic world that he took for granted, but nevertheless says that Newman's vision is one with which those of us who are concerned with education and should from time to time try to refresh ourselves, valuing the vision that Newman is offering. So these critics, and I could mention others, who say, look, it's just not like that anymore. You know, it's all very well saying this great classic book about education, but it's just not like that anymore. Nevertheless, they're saying it is actually offering a vision of education and promoting values in education that we need to defend and protect. It's the idea of teaching universal knowledge that is of which people are often so critical of Newman. You know, just can't do it. I mean, Robert says in one place, no, what are universities expected to do? Just pile on one subject after another after another. It just doesn't work. It's implausible. It's impossible. It can't be done. But Newman himself was clear that, you know, if you've got a university, it's got to teach something, and he was particularly proud of the medical school that he had set up in the university in Dublin. But he's only saying that it's in principle universities should teach everything. In other words, in principle, they should be open to engaging with all knowledge. And in principle, not omitting anything. Doesn't mean that they're going to be able to teach everything. That's obviously not practicable. And it's interesting, where John Roberts makes those comments, it was in a piece that he wrote almost 30 years ago, in 1990, revisiting and reassessing Newman's idea of the university. 1990 was the centenary of Newman's death, and there were all sorts of celebrations and commemorations at that time. But another piece was written in 1990 by Professor Nicholas Lash at Cambridge, which he called A Seat of Wisdom, a Light of the World, Considering the University. And what Lash does is to lay emphasis on the unity of truth and knowledge, which is actually what is fundamental to Newman's point of view. And he quotes Newman, "All that exists, as contemplated by the human mind, forms one large system or complex fact. And this, of course, resolves itself into an indefinite number of particular facts, which, as being portions of a whole, have countless relations of every kind, one towards another. Knowledge is the apprehension of these facts, whether in themselves or in their mutual positions and bearings." To put it another way, what Newman is saying, and what Lash is quoting him as saying, is that the interconnectedness in education of the different subjects, recognizing that's crucial. It's what do you think about it? It's when we see the connections that we come to fresh understanding, isn't it? There's a story. Dilwyn Knox. There were 4 Knox brothers. One was Ronald Knox, who was a predecessor of mine in the Oxford chaplaincy. Evo, who was the editor of Punch for some time. Wilfred, who was an Anglican priest, and Dilwyn. Dilwyn was rather eccentric, but he was brilliant, and he died during the Second World War. But for a time, he was working at Bletchley, cracking codes, and the Enigma code. How do we break the Enigma code? And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, he was in his bath one day wondering about this, And people had said, people used to say about the Enigma code that it's like a typewriter. And he suddenly thought, well, perhaps it's not so much that the Enigma code is like a typewriter, but a typewriter is like the Enigma code. And suddenly thought, I wonder if QWERT is ABCDE. And it was. So it was one of the first steps in cracking the code, because he makes the connection, And that interconnectedness is so important. Newman goes on to say in that passage, which I think Nick Nash also quotes, it's like a short-sighted reader. Like a short-sighted reader, its eye, the eye of the human mind, pours closely and travels slowly over the awful volume which lies open to it. There's a unity to reality. We can only see particular parts at a time. But we look at one, and then another, and then a third, and then a fourth, and gradually we can also begin to see the relationship between them. And I would suggest to you that it's one of the key things for us as Catholics. Father James Heft, who is a professor of religion at the University of Southern California, and indeed, I'm happy to say, a friend of mine, Jim Heft wrote an article about 9 years ago now in Commonweal, and he states there, the Catholic intellectual tradition seeks to integrate knowledge. In a secular society, when you think of our secular society, which is really so keen on expertise, on specialization, which so easily, as I've said, leads to fragmentation, I think one of the contributions in terms of Catholicism that we can make is to recognize the way in which our intellectual tradition is seeking to integrate knowledge. Jim said there ought to be connections between all the subjects studied, because everything that is studied has its source ultimately in God. Somebody who doesn't believe isn't going to accept that, of course, but it's what you and I as Catholics would believe. This is a daunting task given the enormous expansion of knowledge in the past 100 years. Scholars who rely exclusively on already established methodologies within their disciplines will prematurely dismiss important questions they don't know how to answer. That's a consequence of fragmentation. You're only answering the questions which you've got the tools at hand to supply an answer. But what about those other questions? So what Newman was looking for, as he says, I've given you there a quotation, Newman's ideal is a laity not arrogant, not rash in speech, not disputatious, but men who know their religion, who enter into it, who know just where they stand, who know what they hold and what they do not hold, who know their creed so well that they can give an account of it, who know so much of history that they can defend it. I want an intelligent, well-instructed laity. Wants people to be taught the faith. It's that wholeness of the vision in education that he's promoting. I've given you there as well on your sheets that quotation from the famous quotation from the Idea of University, Newman's description of a gentleman. But just look at that. Knowledge is one thing, virtue is another. Now, you can have a lot of knowledge, you can be very clever, but what kind of a person are you? Refinement is not humility, nor is largeness and justness of view faith. Philosophy, however enlightened, however profound, gives no command over the passions, no influential motives, no vivifying principles. You'll see, he's talking about the bottom of that quotation, talks about contending against those giants, the passion and the pride of man. human passions and pride, the force, the strength of that. How do we make people whole? How do we integrate things? How do we mature people? Not just making them experts in this or that. And that image that she gives at the bottom, quarry the granite rock with razors, or moor the vessel with a silk thread. The razor that we use, quarry, sculpt out part of the granite rock simply with a razor, even one of the old cutthroat razors. Not going to do it, are you? Or moor the vessel, tie up a ship with a thread of silk. Can't be done. You know what the kind of ropes that are used on harbours, not threads of silk. Then may you hope, if you can do that, then you may hope with such keen and delicate instruments as human knowledge and human reason to tend against those giants, the passion and pride of man. It's not simply a question of giving people knowledge, expertise. It's a question of a whole human development. I want a laity not arrogant, not rash in speech, not disputatious. I want an intelligent, well-instructed laity, and so forth. And his approach to all that was laid out, I think, best. He set it out best, or most tellingly, in a sermon that he preached in Dublin while he was there as rector. The first of a series of sermons that he preached, which are to be found in his volume Sermons Preached on Various Occasions, or Occasional Sermons. And he says there, here then I conceive is the object of the Holy See and the Catholic Church in setting up universities. The Dublin University had been set up in part through the permission of the Holy See, of course. It is to reunite things which were in the beginning joined together by God and have been put asunder by man. Some persons will say that I am thinking of confining, distorting, and stunting the growth of the intellect by ecclesiastical supervision. I have no such thought. He's not talking about censorship. That's not, nor is he talking about compromise. I have no thought of a compromise, as if religion must give up something and science something. By science, he's meaning more generally, of course, that what would be seen as being, particularly in those days, distinct from religion. I wish the intellect to range with the utmost freedom, and religion to enjoy an equal freedom. But what I am stipulating for is that they should be found in one and the same person, and in one and the same place, and exemplified in the same persons. I want to destroy that diversity of centres which puts everything into confusion by creating a contrariety of influences. I wish the same spots and the same individuals to be at once oracles of philosophy and shrines of devotion. It will not satisfy me, what satisfies so many, to have two independent systems, intellectual and religion, going at once side by side by a sort of division of labour, and only accidentally brought together. It will not satisfy me if religion is here and science there, and young men converse with science all day and lodge with religion in the evening. It's not touching the evil to which these remarks have been directed, if young men eat and drink and sleep in one place and think in another. I want the same roof to contain both the intellectual and moral discipline. It's always men, I'm afraid, because those are the only people going to universities in those days, and so you understand the language. But look, the integrity of both is what he's arguing for, both the religious and what he calls the science. The integrity of both, but having them united. And what does that make us think of? Doesn't that make us think of the incarnation? That's what we believe about Christ. Truly divine, truly human. Not by a kind of compromise, not Christ as divine and appearing to be human. No, truly human as well. Nor truly human and called divine by a kind of poetic license because he was such a wonderful holy man. No, truly divine. And the divine and the human being related, being brought into unity in him perfectly. That's the kind of matrix, if you like, that Newman is really indicating here in this passage. Devotion is not a sort of finish given to the sciences, nor is science a sort of feather in the cap, if I may so express myself, an ornament and set off to devotion. I want the intellectual layman to be religious and the devout ecclesiastic to be intellectual. That's what Newman's seeking to achieve, that combination, that integration of knowledge. And at the heart of it is, I think, is the personal. That's what is really becomes so important for Newman. He wrote to Wilfred Ward, who was the first person to write a major biography of Newman. It came out in 1912, 22 years after Newman had died. In one of those, in a letter that he wrote to him when he was an old man in the 1880s, Newman says, "A religious mind must always master much which is unsure to the non-religious. They have not the same evidence before them." Like, if the religious mind has an eye for something which those who do not believe don't possess. I always think there was a lovely lady I used to know, she's long dead now, but I always remember her saying, she was quite authoritative, and she said, I remember her saying once, rather firmly and dismissively, "I've no time for music." And then after a pause she said sweetly, "Of course I've no ear for it." And it's that really that we're talking about here as well, I think. When we talk about the eye of faith, it's not special pleading. St. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, "We have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit that is from God, so that we may understand the gifts bestowed on us by God. And we speak of these things in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual things to those who are spiritual." We've received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit that is from God. And we've received that Spirit for a purpose, to understand the gifts bestowed on us by God. We need the Spirit of God to understand the gifts that God has bestowed upon us. And then we need to speak of those things in words which are not just taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, so that we interpret spiritual things to those who are spiritual. That's St. Paul. And I think Newman's comment, "A religious mind must always master much which is unsure to the non-religious. They have not the same evidence before them." It's an example that I've often given. I don't know if you remember, a long time ago now, gosh, it must have been, about 40 or more years ago, there was a program on BBC television called Badger Watch. I don't know if any of you remember that. So, do you remember that? And it was about badgers being shy creatures coming out at night into the darkness, where they are, so to speak, invisible. But with the infrared light attached to a camera, it was, of course, possible to film them and to see their activities. And that's often occurred to me when I was watching them, that this illustrates the sort of thing that Paul is saying, that Newman is saying, that to the unaided eye, there's nothing there. There's no badger there with just pitch darkness. There's nobody's there. But the eye of faith, like the camera's eye, with the special light supplied by the Spirit, the infrared light, enables us to see things which otherwise we would presume were not there or dismiss as not being there. That's the sort of thing that Newman is saying. How do we encourage that perceptiveness in people? And I think crucial to it is personal relationships. How well do we manage these things? Jesuit Father Michael Buckley is quite a long time ago, well, about 12, 13 years ago, talked about the challenges and initiatives which Newman inspired come into a single focus to strengthen or restore the primacy of the interpersonal in higher education. It's through relationships that that we really have an influence on people. I don't mean a manipulative, well, it could be a manipulative influence, but when it is done well, it's not a manipulative influence, is it? It's an influence for good. I mean, I've been a priest for almost 50 years now, and I have given lots of talks like this, and I've taught quite a lot in different places, as I was saying to you, and Lord knows how many homilies I've preached, quite apart from the ones over the years that I've had to listen to. It makes me smile to wonder, you know, well, when I think, how much can I remember of things that have been said to me, and how much, I wonder, do people remember of the things that I've said to them? But there is obviously a point in lecturing and preaching and teaching in this more formal way, but the people who but the real influence, I think, does come from particular people. Just think for yourselves, you know. Who are the teachers that influenced you? You can't necessarily, I suspect, remember what they actually said to you, but in the relationship, in the way in which they taught you, they created an atmosphere which encouraged learning. I mean, I think, for example, of Dennis Bethel, who taught me history as a schoolboy. I can't remember very much at all of what Dennis said, but his own enthusiasm for history was what made a great impression upon me. I think of a Spanish Jesuit, Juan Alfaro, who used to teach at the Gregorian in Rome when I was a student there in the 60s. And we all said he was just an outstanding lecturer. I can't remember in detail. Some things I can remember, but I can't remember very much, of course, of what he said 50 years on. But I remember him. I can see him in my mind's eye now, because of the way in which he spoke about the material that he was sharing with us. And in a completely different sort of way, when I was actually, and I've given this advice to other people too, when I was writing up my doctoral thesis, another interest of mine is Graham Greene. And of course, one of the great influences on Greene is Henry James. And I discovered that there was a woman, fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, while I was writing up my thesis, who was giving a course of lectures, which she did each year, I think, on Henry James. So I decided to go to her lectures. Dorothy Bednarowska, a wonderful teacher. It meant that I had to read a James novel every week in order to keep up. And I was writing my thesis at the time, but it was worth it. And actually it was rather good to have something alternative to do, not just to be stuck in the thesis writing all the time. But Henry James' novels, by and large, are not short. Dorothy was a wonderful teacher and became a good friend too. But who's impressed you? Who are the teachers that matter to you? Again, Newman, an academical system without the personal influence of teachers upon pupils is an Arctic winter. It will create an ice-bound, petrified, cast-iron university and nothing else. The vital instrument, we're thinking about teaching the faith, is how do we relate to people? Not just getting the stuff across. It's very important to be able to teach and to teach effectively and to help people to understand the content of the faith is vital. But that's going to happen more effectively through the relationships that we create. And I suspect that all of us actually are remembering a lot more of what we have been taught by these good teachers than we realize. They're all sort of, we don't remember the teacher, we don't remember precisely when it was said to us. But because of the relationship and because of the way in which they have taught us, it's entered into us and in a way has become our own. I think the vital instrument, the vehicle of education, the vital is personal influence, the witness that we give. I think, as I've said to you, what we bring to our educating is an awareness of wholeness, of unity, of interconnectedness. We need, I think, we need to be strong about that. To recognize the importance of expertise, of specialization, but not to allow it to fragment so that we sort of lose the connections between things. And we do that, as I say, and as Newman has said, most effectively through our own personal witness, through the relationships that we form. And remember Paul VI in Evangelii Nunciandi, that modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers, and if he does listen to teachers, it's because they are witnesses. I think we have to live the mysteries. Thank you.